principles and process of communication. Important factor in terms of communication is there must be consistency in your thought. In communication, content is important, context is important, consistency is important, clarity is important. In communication, what is important to know, the message should be timely. Let me give an example in terms of trying to substantiate what we are discussing. In terms of tourism, there are major festivals in India. If you are giving, you have to give timely information. There are major festivals in India. Pongal and Sankranti is in January in Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh, and you need to give information in the month of January. Vasant Panchami is a major festival. Again, January, February. Vasant Panchami is celebrated all over India. Republic Day is on January 26th. Other kinds of festivals, if we take Shivratri, is in the month of February. Then if you're talking about Bakrid, which is celebrated all over India, then you were talking about Spring Festival. And then we have Baisakhi in Punjab, particularly in the month of April. Then we have Nag Panchami in month of July and August. Onam is a major festival in September in Kerala. Amarnath pilgrimage is in July and August in Kashmir. So Ganesh Chaturthi, August, September, mainly in Maharashtra, now all over the country. You need to give them specific information. Lot of tourists who are coming from all over the world are interested in major festivals of India. India has got a very rich culture. As tourism, if you want to promote the major cultural diversity of India, because the major cultural diversity of India is reflected through major Indian festivals. We are going to be discussing the basic principles of communication. Any student has to have an understanding about what are the basic principles of communication. As students of tourism, you need to have much more understanding on the basic principles of communication. Communication is a two-way process. Communication is not a monologue. Communication is a dialogue. Communication takes place from sender to the receiver and from the receiver back. The process of communication is not complete as long as we do not get reaction or comment or feedback. And that is where, when we are talking about the communication is a two-way process, the mental makeup of the sender is important in communication. Who is the sender? What is his mental makeup? Has the sender understood the audience? What are the needs of the audience? What kind of information the audience are looking for? And that is where you need to go about making your information very specific to the needs of the audience. Audience have got different kinds of demands, different kinds of requirements, different kinds of emotional approaches or emotional needs and information needs. If you understand their information needs, you will be in a position to give them information which they are looking for. Principles and communication approaches. It's easy to talk about communication, but difficult to see that receivers get the nature and the kind of information you want to give them. There are psychological problems in terms of communication, or if you want to call them psychological barriers. There are physical barriers in terms of communication. There can be mental disturbance. There can be preoccupation. Some audience can have ego. Some audience can have anxiety. They are tired. They already have some idea, preconceived notions, preconceived ideas. Audience can also have a closed mind, and they have some notions. It is very, very important that you need to understand their psychological needs. As long as you don't understand who are they, what are they looking for, your communication is not going to be very effective. So the psychological factors need to be taken into consideration. There are also physical factors which come in the way of communication. Disturbances, distraction in the environment. The place where you are communicating, there can be disturbances and distractions. If you are using a mic, maybe there is some kind of a problem with the mic itself. There is disturbance, there is echo, there is a resound. The audience are not in a position to listen to you properly, which means there is a communication breakdown. So you need to understand why communication breaks down. There are psychological issues, there are physical issues. You will only be in a position to solve these problems in communication provided you understand why you are communicating. I want to give you a formula. Here, I, M, P, R, E, S, and another S. Impress. That is the formula I am going to be discussing. As communication principles, it is very important for you to understand this formula. Number one, I stands for idea. In communication, you have an idea. You are communicating that idea to your target audience. There are different kinds of ideas you can have, but you need to be very specific about what is the idea you want to give them. Let me give an example how we can go about giving an idea. The major historic sites in India, that's an idea. I'm going to be giving them information relating to the major historic sites or historic tourist places in India. Then M stands for message. Message is very, very important in communication. What is the message you want to give? You have decided that you want to give them the major historic sites in India. As part of your message, India Gate is a major historic place in India. Red Fort is a major historic place in India. Rashtrapati Bhavan is a major historic place in India. Qutub Minar, Meenakshi Temple, Jamma Masjid, Golden Temple, Taj Mahal, Gateway of India, Kailash Temple, Charminar in Hyderabad, Somnath Temple in Gujarat, Sun Temple again in Gujarat, Nalanda in Bihar, Ajanta Cave in Maharashtra, Elephanta Cave in Maharashtra. If you want to give message about these historic places, you need to have specific, precise information. And only when you have precise information, you will be in a position to delivering your message very effectively. If you just want to give an example about India Gate, Delhi, you need to explain it is a memorial to over 90,000 Indian soldiers who died in World War I. You need to have that information. If you want to give information about Red Fort in Delhi, this is a citadel of the 7th Delhi Sajanabad. It's over 2 kilometers in circumference. You need to know all about Red Fort. Same is the case with Rashtrapati Bhavan, which is located in Delhi, the official residence of the President of India. It is in 330 acres of land. The message has to be comprehensive. Message has to be useful to the audience. Message should be clear. Message should be clear. Message should be specific. Message should be comprehensive. Your message should have details, because different kinds of people are looking for different kinds of messages. Then P stands for pause. You should know how to communicate. You should know when to give a pause. You should know how to go about expressing. You should make your communication impressive. You must modulate your voice. A great deal of communication is not only verbal communication, non-verbal communication. Your gestures, your eye contact, the way you go about giving a pause, the way you go about modulating your voice becomes important. Because in communication, there are receivers. We are transmitting message to the receivers. You have to understand your receivers. Your receivers come from different kinds of cultural backgrounds. Maybe sometimes, your receivers are from Asia, from Africa, from Europe, from United States of America, from UK. Different kinds of cultural situation, your receivers are there. And that's where you need to have an understanding about your receivers. I said, tourism industry in India is growing very rapidly. It is getting enormous foreign revenue for this country. India is becoming one of the major tourist destinations in the world. Tourists are coming from all over the world. So your receivers are culturally varied, culturally different linguistic background, different language background, different social backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, different economic backgrounds. Your receivers are there. That's where communication need to be made audience specific. Then one of the important factors in communication is empathy. This empathy is an extremely important feature in communication. You need to be sensitive to the needs of your receivers. As long as you do not have empathy, as long as you do not understand their needs and requirements, their emotional requirements, psychological requirements, their information requirements, as long as you do not put yourself in their position, you will not be in a position to communicate. And it is also important in terms of communication, you need to have a security check. What do you mean by security check? The interpretation of words, their perception, their attitude, their opinion. You need to check whether they are understanding the words the way you are using. Communication should not lead to distortion. Communication should not have double meaning. Communication should have one meaning. Communication is not ambiguous. Communication is precise. Communication is specific. Communication is clear. And communication is clarifying to the audience. Communication takes place all the time. Sometimes communication is taking place consciously or unconsciously. And communication takes place through verbal and non-verbal signs. Non-verbal communication is important. The meaning of words is important. The way you want to understand a particular word, the audience should also understand in the same way. And communication is a two-way process. There is a difference between information and communication. Information, a telephone directory gives information. Yellow pages give information. But communication is a two-way process. We are communicating from the sender to the receiver, and we are also getting a feedback. When we get feedback, it becomes a two-way process. Transmission of message is important, and reception of message is also equally important. All the time we pay attention in terms of transmitting the message, but we also need to find out how the message has been received. Reception of the message is equally important. The basic objectives of communication. In communication, establishing human relations. In communication, we are trying to establish empathy. By communication, we are trying to persuade people. Convincing people is important. We are trying to motivate them through communication. Communication is a dialogue. Communication is conversation. You must listen. Listening is as important in communication as speaking. Communication can only take place effectively when there is exchange of ideas, exchange of thoughts. Communication also helps in understanding. There are 7 important factors in terms of communication. 1, human relations. 2, empathy. 3, persuasion. 4, dialogue. 5, information. 6, influence. 7, understanding. These are the 7 important factors which go in effective communication. Let us try to get some understanding about what are the major goals in terms of communication. In communication, we want the listeners to understand what we are saying. Very important concept in communication. Every person has got to know a frame of understanding, frame of reference. We need to understand what is his frame of reference. Are we communicating at his level? Are we communicating the way he can understand? Are we trying to simplify communication? Are we trying to explain in communication? All communication is explanation. Communication is conveying information about something which someone does not have an idea about, someone does not have information about. And that is where, in all communication, we are trying to capture listeners' attentions by cleverly designing our communication approaches. Communication is becoming more challenging in a modern age. Media is growing rapidly. Mass communication is growing rapidly. There is no other country in the world where mass media is growing as rapidly in India. The number of television channels in this country are about 800 television channels in this country. The number of newspapers and magazines in this country is about 70,000. FM radio, frequency modulation, is growing rapidly. India is the largest film producing country in the world. Internet is growing rapidly in this country. Social media, as we are calling it, is growing rapidly in this country. So there is an expanding role for communication in a modern age. And a person should be very familiar in terms of when to use what kind of a medium for communication. Different kinds of media which are available for communication. And all those media needs to be used for communication, for influencing people, for motivating people, for giving information to your target audiences. In addition to some of the basic principles I talked about, I would like to identify some other important factors in terms of communication, which I will call them 7 C's of communication. 1, credibility. 2, context of communication. Content of communication. Clarity in communication. Channels of communication. Consistency and capability of audience. Credibility. Who is communicating? What is his credibility of the source? Which organization is communicating? Which channel is communicating? Who is the person who is communicating? Is important. That's where the credibility factor is important in communication. Second important factor is the context of communication. In what kind of a context you are communicating? In a country like India, with about 1.2 billion population, there are rural audience, there are urban audience, there are literate audience, there are illiterate audience, there are people in different languages, there are people in different communities, there are people with different religions in this country. In what kind of a context you are communicating? The social background of your audience, the cultural background of your audience, the linguistic background, the language background, the religious background of the audience. And in addition to that, in terms of, are you communicating in a rural setting, are you communicating in an urban setting, are you communicating to Indian audience, are you communicating to foreign audience? In the case of tourism, the context becomes very important. And the content of information. What is the information you want to give? What is the message you want to give? How precisely you can go about giving that information? Only when you know your content, you will be in a position to precisely communicate. Your communication should not be heavily loaded. You should not give too many facts, too much of statistics. Audience are not interested. Many of them are not interested in too much of data, too much of statistics. Clarity in communication is important. You must make your communication as clear, as simple as possible. And channels of communication. Is it interpersonal communication, group communication? Are you using mass media for communication? Are you communicating through internet? Internet is becoming a major medium of communication in this country. Social media is growing rapidly in the world and also growing rapidly in India. So what kind of a channel you want to use? Radio is available, television is available, newspapers are available. So what kind of a medium you want to use? What kind of a channel you want to use? Consistency in communication. What you have said should be consistent. If there is any kind of inconsistency in communication, the audience is confused. They will not accept your message. So you must plan your message so that your message is consistent. Very important factor, capability of audience. The last C. What is the capacity of your audience? How much of it they can understand? How much of it they can assimilate? What are their information levels? What are their intellectual levels? What are their language levels? In which language you need to communicate? Should you communicate in English, in Kannada, in Telugu, in Malayalam, in Marathi? That again is important. Communication is a challenge in this country. It is a challenge because we are a very diverse and a plural society. As long as we do not understand that plurality, as long as we do not understand the diversity of India, we will not be in a position to communicate effectively. Before I summarize, I would like to give some essential characteristics of communication. Clarify ideas before communicating. You need to clarify yourself before you communicate. As long as you do not have that understanding, you will not be in a position to communicate effectively. Number two, examine the purpose of communication. You need to know why you want to communicate. What is the purpose of communication? As long as you do not know the purpose of why you're communicating, you cannot communicate effectively. Number three, take the entire environment and physical and human into consideration. You need to take the environmental factor, physical factors, and human factors into consideration before you go about communicating effectively. Planning is important in terms of communication. You want to communicate orally, you want to communicate in a written form, you want to use media for communication, and the content of the message needs to be planned very well. The next factor, always make an effort to convey useful information. And then the other important factor in terms of communication is follow-up on communication. A very important factor in communication, be a good listener. You have to listen in communication. Listening is as important in communication as speaking. As a tourist professional, as a student of tourism, people have doubts. People want to clarify. People asking for information. People are asking for different kinds of information. You must listen to what is that they are asking for. There are other kinds of factors which are important in communication. What are the objectives for communicating? That is one factor. Clarity in use of language is important in communication. What is the amount of communication you want to give? You should not give too much or too less. You need to decide the amount of communication, the amount of information you want to give, and adequate medium, the nature of medium you want to use for communication. And you need to see that there is appropriate conditions for communication so that in communication does not get distorted. Avoid unintentional communication. You should not communicate excessively. And all communication needs to be corroborated with actions. All of you, for communicating effectively, you must develop communication skills. What are the process of communication? How does communication take place? The 7 C's of communication. The impress factor, which I have given, where I have identified some elements of communication, and 10 commandments of communication, which I have given. I will list them again. Objectives for communicating: 1, clarity in use of language; 3, amount of communication, neither too much or not too less; 4, adequate medium for communication; listen attentively; avoid unintentional communication; corroborate action with statements. Communication is a two-way process. Develop effective communication skills.